All right, Algebra 1B students, welcome to part 1 of your video on lesson 12.5. In this video, we're going to be talking about different types of data that we can see when we're doing statistics problems. Okay, different types of data that we can collect from people and things like that. Okay, when you collect data, you either collect one of two types of data. It's either quantitative data or it's qualitative data. Okay, quantitative data measure quantities and can be described numerically, and they can be manipulated numerically, such as test scores, ages, heights, weights, things like that. Okay, they measure quantities, some amount of something, some amount of years, some amount of weight, some amount of minutes, something like that. Okay, and they can be described numerically, such as test scores, ages. They are things that can be averaged. Another good way to think of that. Okay, quantitative data can be averaged. The other type of data that we have would be qualitative. Qualitative data names, they name qualities and they put them in certain categories. Okay, they put them in categories, they put them in sections. They can be words or numbers. There's different different examples of qualitative data, but it's things like hair color, okay, brown hair, blue eyes, things like that. Male, female, right? Gender would be qualitative data. Things like zip codes, things like phone numbers. Those things are all qualitative data as well. Even though they're numbers that can't be measured. You can't, add two zip codes together, right? You can't add or average zip codes or phone numbers or things like that. Okay, so those are qualitative types of data, and the other is quantitative types of data. Okay, so the first part of your practice problem set is going to involve just looking at some different types of data and deciding, is this data set qualitative or quantitative? Again, qualitative meaning numbers that can be added, subtracted, averaged, and things like that. Or, qualitative, not numbers that can be averaged. These are categories of things. Quantitative, quantity, that's about number, amount, how many, things like that. Okay? So whenever you see the word like favorite or something like that, or preferences in a data set, you're always talking about qualitative data, okay? Because this data, they're not numbers, it's favorite movie. It's like this movie, this movie, this movie. You're putting people into different categories, so that is an example of qualitative data, okay? Number of students in different schools who take Spanish. Well, certain schools have different numbers of students. There's a key word here, numbers of students. And these data certainly are numerical quantities. They can be added together. They can be averaged. You can, manipulate those numbers in that way. So that is an example of quantitative data. Quantitative data, okay? Numbers, quantitative data. Football jersey numbers. Now, this says numbers, but it's different than the numbers in letter B. Because football jersey numbers, they don't measure any quantity of anything. You can't find the average of three guys' jersey numbers. It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't tell you anything interesting. So even though this data is numbers, it's actually an example of qualitative data because you're putting guys in certain categories based on those jersey numbers. Okay? So based on those three examples, I'd like you to just tell me real quick, these two examples, is this set qualitative, quantitative? You don't have to worry about explaining your answer. Just make sure you understand the difference between qualitative and quantitative. So pause the video for 30 seconds, decide in your head or on paper what each of those is going to be, and then come on back and I will show you what we should have. Letter A, the cost of CDs. You can talk about average cost. You can talk about adding cost. These are numbers you can manipulate. So the first set here is quantitative data. And then I-color is an example I gave you already of qualitative data. It's not numbers, it's just categories. You're putting people into different categories, okay? So hopefully qualitative versus quantitative makes sense to you. That is, as I mentioned, just a distinction between different sets of data, two categories you can put them in, okay? There is also a distinction when we're dealing with sets of data between what's known as univariate and bivariate. Okay, U-N-I means one, bi means two. So these talk about how many variables is a certain data set talking about. Okay, so there are sometimes sets of data that only use one variable. You just took a set of data and you just looked at one variable all the way straight down. An example of that would be like the atomic weights of elements in the periodic table. You look at all the elements of the periodic table and all you care about are the atomic weights of the elements in the periodic table. Okay? You're only looking at their atomic weights. One variable, atomic weights. Then you could have a different set of data where you take a bunch of different sized cubes and you record two different things about it. You record the length of an edge of the cube and you record the volume. So now in this case you have two variables, which means this set of data is bivariate. Bivariate meaning two variables. Bivariate, two variables. Obviously the other example is univariate, one variable, just the atomic weights of the elements. Okay? Take a look at these two sets of data here, things that you're recording, and tell me if they are univariate or bivariate. And then also, if you can, tell me if they are qualitative or quantitative as well. All right, pause the video. Try to tell me each of those things about each set of data, A and B here. Qualitative or quantitative, and univariate or bivariate. Okay, letter A, we're talking about heights and weights of mammals. Obviously here we have two variables. We're talking about height and weight, recording both of those. So you have bivariate data. And heights and weights are both a quantitative variable. Okay, bivariate and quantitative. Because heights and weights are both numbers that can be averaged. We can talk about inches, we can talk about pounds, we can talk about anything we want in terms of numbers that can be manipulated, so it is quantitative. All right, letter B says the cost of internet service from several different providers. So you look at each provider, you look at the cost of their internet service. Well, they're only looking at one variable here, so that's when we talk about univariate data. And again, this is something when we talk about cost of something that is always quantitative, because cost is something that you can manipulate. You can average cost, you can add costs together, subtract, all those kinds of things. So letter A is bivariate and quantitative, letter B is univariate and quantitative as well. Okay? If you have questions about any of these vocabulary words, bivariate, quantitative, univariate, qualitative, from here, qualitative. If you have any questions about those, please make a note to ask me in class tomorrow. Otherwise, that's all I have for you. Have a wonderful night.